This is Bill Brady, One United Body. I'm doing another video as part of the Leadership Training School. This video is entitled The History of the School of the Prophets. So we're going to go back to Elijah and Elisha, and then we'll go back further to show you the history of the School of the Prophets. And then on later recording, another recording, I'll show you about, reveal to you the future of the School of the Prophets. So at the time of Elijah was a prophet who was a father prophet. In other words, he trained other prophets. He trained Elisha as his son to take over his place after Elijah was taken up. So Elijah was the father prophet, training Elisha as a son prophet. And then when Elijah was taken up, Elisha moved up to be the father prophet. There's another group that Elijah taught, and that was the School of the Prophets. He functioned as a father head for Elisha, and he functioned as a father head for those who were in the School of the Prophets. And those who were in the School of the Prophets were called the sons of the prophets. What's the difference? Elijah and Elisha. Elijah was a father prophet, training Elisha as his son to become the father prophet to replace him. The sons of the prophet that were trained in the school of the prophets were never going to be fathers. They weren't going to train other prophets. They were fully trained prophets. Elijah or Elisha could send them to do things that Elijah or Elisha themselves would do, send them off to say something to a king or something, but to prophesy something to a king. But they were never going to be trainers of prophets. Further back in biblical history, there was always one Melchizedek on the earth. And sometime during that Melchizedek's life, he would call a son to train up to replace him, so that when he died, his son would take his place. So there was a father Melchizedek and a son Melchizedek. And there was also the School of the Prophets. Either the father Melchizedek himself or the son Melchizedek was being trained as Melchizedek would function as the head of the School of the Prophets. So men like Enoch and Noah and Shem, either they were the head of the School of the Prophets or their son that they were training was the head of the School of the Prophets. So there was always a School of the Prophets on the earth, one School of the Prophets on the earth. Today, there are many schools of the prophets. These are being headed up by a prophet who was a father prophet, but the difference is they are functioning in the kingdom age. And this previous, like Enoch and Noah and so on, they were functioning in the age of Melchizedek and higher. So there was always a Melchizedek who was the head of a school of the prophets, either a father Melchizedek or a son Melchizedek, who was a head of the School of the Prophets. This was true on the earth until Jacob, and then it ended. Up until that point, the person who was Melchizedek was prophet, king, and priest, all three of these offices in one person. First prophet, then king, then priest. At the time of Jacob, these three offices were split up. So there was a line of prophets that went down through history, and Elijah and Elisha were two that were part of that line of prophets. And each of them headed up a school of the prophets. So there was always a school of the prophets during this time of history too. At the end of this process, John the Baptist was the head of a school of prophets. He had 30 trainee prophets in his school. Then then John the Baptist died. He didn't train a replacement for himself. Yeshua took over from John, but not as the head of the school of the prophets. He took over and founded the first school of the apostles. Then Yeshua died. Of course, he was resurrected and ascended and seated in heavenly places. But after Yeshua's departure, a prophet named Agabus was given headship to become the prophet, the major prophet on the earth at that time. And he then restored the school of the prophets. So here's a summary of what I've just told you. Since very early times, there has always been a school of the prophets on the earth, either and the person that was heading up that school of prophets, that was in headship over that school of prophets, that was the father of that school of prophets, was either a Melchizedek, one at a time on the earth, or the Melchizedek's son that was being trained up to take his place, or at a later time, the head of the school of the prophets was the prophet, the one on the earth at that time that was the prophet who trained other prophets. And that person then was the head, the father of the school of the prophets, training up the sons of the prophets in the school of the prophets. And this has been this way from early on up until the time of Yeshua, then restored with Agabus being the prophet, the head of the school of the prophets. And then at some point, it ended. I don't know where it was in history that it ended, but at some point it ended. And today there are many schools of the prophets you can find online, many of them geographical around the world, many of them just online only, but none of them are the school of the prophets, because all these school of prophets that you see today are functioning as a prophet in the kingdom age. I'm sorry, in the kingdom age. None of them are functioning as a prophet in the age of Melchizedek, that I'm aware of anyway. But none of them are the prophet, and none of the fathers that are heading this up are the prophet, and none of these schools of the prophets are the school of the prophets. Okay, so there's a history of the school of the prophets. And I hope that you're already beginning to be filled with anticipation about what happens next.